Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Emma. I'm one of the librarians here at Rockland Public Library, and we are so thrilled to be hosting tonight's talk. Thank you for our patience during some brief technical difficulties there. I want to start off by saying or introducing the next couple events that are going to be happening here at the library. Next week on February 16th, we'll be celebrating the new films that have just been entered into the public domain this year, with a screening of The Kid Brother on the 16th at 6:00 p.m. That stars Harold Lloyd in what is commonly considered one of his best films. It's a silent film. It's supposed to be really fun. And then the week after that, on the 23rd, also at 6 p.m., we'll be hosting Tracing Civil War Family History with Amy Truesdell, who has traced the experiences of her great-grandfather as an infantryman in the 27th New York Volunteers in the Civil War. And that promises to be really interesting too. People who are joining us in person are welcome during the Q&A portion to raise your hand, and I'll run this little handheld mic over to you so that people on Zoom can also hear your question. And then people on Zoom are welcome to type your questions into the chat, and then I'll just read them aloud for Greg as we go. And so I'm very thrilled to introduce tonight's speaker. Greg Marley has been collecting, studying, eating, growing, and teaching mushrooms for over 45 years. He has spread his love of mushrooms to hundreds through walks, talks, and classes he's held across New England over the past 30 years. He's also the author of 2 popular mushroom books, and as a volunteer mushroom identification consultant to poison centers across New England since 2001, he provides expertise in mushroom poisoning cases. And I'm going to turn it right over to Greg. Go right ahead.
Good evening. I didn't know you didn't know what I'm going to do yet. Welcome. For those of you who came further than hope, you braved a snowstorm to get here. Those of you who are sitting in the comfort of your home, enjoy. So we're going to talk about mushrooms today, right? And this is really just a talk designed for people who are just starting out. So, some of you may have started out 20 years ago and still feel that way, but we're gonna aim this at people who want to kind of get an idea of what mushrooms are out there and how I might approach this. And my experience is, like me, when I started collecting mushrooms way back, let's just say I bought my first mushroom book in 1975. What really led me was my gut and the desire to put something appropriate in it and to avoid putting something inappropriate in it. And so how many people here have collected and eaten at least one wild mushroom? And for you who've done that, how many of it were Chanterelles? And how many were Morels? And if they're Morels, they're telling me it probably was not in this state, right? We'll talk about Morels in this state as well, because I have collected a ton of Morels within 5 miles of here. But we'll talk about those. So we're gonna enter this through the lens of those mushrooms you need to start with if you're gonna start collecting and using mushrooms.
Sorry, it's okay if you turn the lights down so we can really write.
Yeah, I'll bet. So I started going out playing with mushrooms in the same way that I went out playing in the world. I enter nature as a place where I can relax and be quiet and kind of observe. And that's where I still go. When I'm out mushrooming, unless I'm teaching a group, I mostly want to be alone. I've got a couple people I go mushrooming with, but if someone says, "Hey, Greg, I know you're always out in the woods. Can I go with you?" I say, "No, that's my time." And so for me, going out mushroom, that's that place, just like John Muir. I go to lose my mind and find my soul. And along the way, I play with a lot of mushrooms. I engage my mind in that study, but really it's to relax. And we have to start right here. How many people were raised in a family where they said, "Don't touch those things, they'll poison you. And if they poison you, they're likely to kill you"? Yeah, that was America. That was America until just a very few short years ago. We are a country that is mycophobic, which is a term coined by a man named Gordon Wasson and his wife, Valentina Pavlona. And to describe a culture that starts out with that mistrust of mushrooms. I was raised in a family where my mother was German and French. And later, after I was already eating mushrooms, said, well, you know, when I was a girl growing up on the ranch in Montana, we used to go out and collect mushrooms. And she collected morels and meadow mushrooms. And the other ones she wasn't clear about were probably shaggy mates, some of the foolproof mushrooms. But my dad, Irish Welsh. And, you know, my mother was not so fond to say the only mushrooms that were allowed in our house were the ones that she snuck in to the tuna noodle casserole in the cream of Campbell's soup, you know, cream of mushroom soup. So I kind of broke some rules when I dove in here. And this is some artwork from a woman named Beatrix Cromwell. And she plays with that concept of toadstools. So I have never seen the culture change so rapidly around mushrooms as it has, you know, starting 20, 25, 30 years ago, but really increased in the past 10 years, and even more so during the pandemic. People are just wild about them. And they're wild about edibles. They're wild about getting out and collecting them. And they're just incredible in interest in the psychotropics, the magic mushrooms. But we won't get into those tonight because those are not the foolproof group. So what happens in this state? How many people here are birders? How many birds are in the state of Maine? Probably less than 300 species. How many plants in the state of Maine? You know, maybe 750. Mushrooms? We have at least 2,000 species of mushrooms in this state. You know, some of them are tiny. Some of them are really leathery or tough or woody, but there's a lot of them. So talk about an opportunity for lifelong learning. That's mushrooms. About 10% of those roughly are known to be edible. About 10% of them are known to be toxic. And a whole bunch of them, we're still trying to learn about them, or they're too tiny, again, too tough. And a few of them, you know, roughly maybe a dozen species are poisonous enough to potentially cause death. And a whole lot more can make you wish you were dying for the few hours that they go through your system. So to start out with, you have to think about, okay, how do we approach this safely? I'm one of the people that was poisoned by mushrooms, 1986, early August. And I know that mushroom really, really well. And all the books that I had at that point, I looked it up and they said, oh, it's edible. And the old Audubon Field Guide, published in 1978, said, oh, not only is it edible, doesn't have any toxic lookalikes. Go for it. Whatever version of it grows up here, I've dealt with personally, you know, cases, maybe 30 different cases, 35 of people sickened by that species. Remember it, the lilac brown bolete. I think I've got a picture of it somewhere in here. So what we got started is a concept, a thought. What are the mushrooms that are easy to identify, that have no toxic lookalikes, that have a good established history of edibility? And it was that early branding that came about from a guy named Clyde Christensen, who was a mycologist in the Midwest, late, mid-1930s up until the early 60s. And he published a book in 1939 that says, common edible mushrooms. And in that, he had this cute little chapter of the Foolproof 4. What are the mushrooms in that region? Again, he was Midwest. They were easy to identify, common, good, edible. And for him, the Foolproof 4 were these. The Morels, and he kind of lumped them all together, anything in the genus Morchella. We'll talk about those. The sulfur shelf, we know it more commonly today as the chicken of the woods, but I learned it as a sulfur shelf, so I'll use it because that's the word he used. And pretty much all the puffballs, any of them that when you cut them open, they're pure white on the inside and firm. He said, those are edible, go for it. And the shaggy mate. one of my favorite mushrooms. So when I started thinking about this concept of foolproof mushrooms, and I said, what if I did a foolproof mushrooms for Maine or for New England? And I said, 4? No way, way too small. So let's do something catchy. Do you do a nifty 9, a sumptuous 7? And what I came up with was the idea, how about if we have a foolproof few? Those mushrooms that you find in the area where you tromp around, that you can learn, that kind of fit these qualifications. So we're going to deal with about 12 of them. And at some point, you're going to ask me, well, why didn't you include that one? And why didn't you include this one? And we can deal with that. And some of these I include, first and foremost, in New England, we're going to talk about the Chanterelle. A couple of times, most recently at the beginning of the pandemic and once about 15 years ago, I put out these surveys to anybody I knew or anybody on my mailing list who was a mushroomer. And I said, what do you eat? How long have you been doing this? What are your favorites? If you were listing 10, what are your favorite 10s in rank order? Some questions like that. And, the Chanterelle, the golden Chanterelle, was by far the number one. But this is the list that I would include in that. Chanterelles, a couple different species, the black trumpet in that same family. I have Morels on there, but only if you can find them, because they're not easy to find in Maine. So they don't fit that quite common category here. Hen of the woods, the maitake, the oyster mushrooms, 3 different species easily. The lion's mane, comb tooth, bear's head, hidden them if you're old enough. The sweet tooth or hedgehogs, shaggy manes from Clyde Christensen's, the lobster mushroom, and I'm really going to be questioning that one. I still struggle with that as a foolproof mushroom. And the puffballs, and we'll talk about a few others. Anybody know this guy? This snail is called the white-lipped snail, Neohelix albularis. And among other things, it's most active at night, and boy, it loves mushrooms. Unfortunately, they're not as common as slugs, who also love mushrooms. So let's start with a golden chanterelle. For years, we called this Chanterelles siberius. That's the formal name. But it's the European species. And now we're trying to untangle how many different chanterelles we have here. So we're going to call it the golden chanterelles. And I have that parentheses because there's several of them. And this is, was significantly the most common eaten collected mushroom in Maine and New England. Because it's common. You find it in a lot of different forest types, growing, symbiotically with a number of different tree species. And I call it really, really loyal. And loyal to me means, along by about the middle of July, earlier if we get rains and a little bit early warming, later if it's been dry, you can find this species, these mushrooms, in the same place almost every year, as long as we have adequate rain. How many people have your favorite chanterelle patch? I've had a number of them, yeah. And you go back there year after year. On the islands, they grow with the spruce and fir. Around here, I find them a lot with hemlock. There's a variety that grows with oaks and beech. That's just a lovely one. And you find them anywhere from July, typically, all the way through last year, even into October, because they started late because it was so freaking dry along the coast. And they're yummy. Now, I'm going to show you what you need to be aware of, because there are some people that confuse chanterelles with the jack-o'-lantern mushroom. So I'll show you a couple pictures of those. So here's the typical, you can find them, and these are on my backyard on a sheet, but these are in the forest, and you can see some little tiny nubs just opening and some mature ones at the same time in the same patch. Chanterelles grow slowly. So when you find that little nubbin just starting, as long as there's adequate rain, let it go. Because there was a study, and it was done on the West Coast, and showed that the average golden chanterelle there, lasts on average almost 60 days and up to 90 days if it has adequate rain. And it grows and matures slowly. Most people like them when they're kind of young, they're a little bit more tender. And the underside, where the spores develop, where we would call them gills, but this little kind of folds there, they fork a little bit. And the color, that golden color, the cap, the underside, the stem, pretty much all the same color. And they're really yummy. Some of them are really large. This is a variety that grows under oaks, and I really commonly find them. They're like the West Coast chanterelles. They can be quite meaty. Same flavor. And you ever smell chanterelles? They've got this gentle odor. I equate it to apricots. It's slightly fruity. And now smell is the most subjective of our senses. So you give it to 10 people, some say, smells earthy. Some people say, oh yeah, fruity. So it varies. Do that with your chanterelles. Now, what do we do when we find them? This is a mushroom you don't want to put into tomato sauce. Overwhelms it. They do really well, with butter, oils, because the flavor elements are mostly fat soluble. They do really excellent work with eggs or fish or chicken in a cream sauce over chicken or a white-faced flesh fish. Lovely. If you're going to preserve them, try not to dry them. Freeze and saute and freeze them is great. Some people pickle or other that way, but drying, the texture totally changes. So this is one. I was out in the West Coast last month, did a talk in Marin County, and this is a California, different species of golden chanterelle, but very different, very robust. And this is the one you need to watch out for. If you ever see this cluster of what look like chanterelles, 20, 30, 40 growing together from a single point on the ground, usually at the base of a tree, usually more orange, unless they've been faded by the sun, than that golden yellow, don't eat them. Guaranteed 5 to 7 hours of, we call it worshiping at the porcelain bowl. But they're gorgeous and they're magical. They glow in the dark, bioluminescence, quite neat, but don't eat them. And they grow, often this is a typical, this was actually photograph taken in Camden at the base of an oak tree. They grow from the roots in the lower end of the trunk of an oak tree, rotting it. And so you get these huge clumps. Now, in the same family as the golden chanterelle are the black trumpets. Different genus, very, very distinctive. There's a couple of things that vaguely look like them, also edible. And I find them very, very rarely. This is a mushroom, when they're mature, you can almost find them by their smell. They have this rich, rich odor. Now, unlike the chanterelle, which is almost always going to be there if we get a little bit of rain, black trumpets like abundant rain. So if you were looking for black trumpets last summer in this region, you were probably doomed to not find them, unless you may have found them well into October and early November. But the year before, wow, just an incredible treasure trove of black trumpets across much of the state. They like to grow with oak trees and beech. Occasionally I find them with hemlock, and in a really, really wet year, sometimes even with white pine, but they really prefer, growing symbiotically with oak trees. And so if you find where they were growing 2 years ago, keep looking there, particularly if we have a wet year. I found them anywhere in a wet year from the end of June and well into November. They're my favorite. I say there are few caveats because there's really nothing that are compared to it. Sometimes you'll find them, these ones, this kind of pale, almost ochre color. The spore color on these is that kind of faded orange ochre. And sometimes you see them kind of tannish, particularly in drier weather. And sometimes midsummer, we find them with the yellowfoot chanterelle, a smaller, more fine-boned chanterelle. And for cooking, they're just scrumptious. Thin flesh, they dry, they cook up quickly. If you're going to clean them, just kind of break off these ends and cook the rest of it. They incredibly versatile with cooking. A robust, deep flavor. They can stand up to almost anything. I've enjoyed them on pizza. I love to dry them and use them in a risotto or a stew. It just enriches almost anything. There's just simply sauteed with eggs are great. Do grilled cheese with good cheese. Do 2 layers of cheese and put the sliced raw black trumpets between them, and then cook it slow. Just one of my favorites. So oyster mushrooms, you can find these in the market. They're easy to cultivate. We have three common species here. And you can start seeing them, say, on the coast of Maine here, along about a week or two after Mother's Day, end of May. They start appearing on aspen, popple, they call it here. And they're called the aspen oyster. It's Pleurotus populinus. And then they're going to fade as the summer starts. And when the heat of summer comes and you get those lovely heavy rainfalls, you're going to find the summer oyster, populinus, on beech and ash, not ash, beech, maple, mostly, occasionally ash. And then in the late fall, you see the big ones on sugar maple, a lot of them. And they're all edible. They're a rapid rotter of heartwood. The only thing you have to do sometimes is get ahead of the beetles. So here's a picture of some fruiting in midsummer. You can see the little beetles that you might either have to evict or decide that they've had too much of lunch, and so you're going to leave them there. So oyster mushrooms are great edible, and they're great medicinal. Anybody here struggle with high cholesterol, blood lipid profile? Is your doctor saying, you got to watch out, eat more oyster mushrooms? It's got a compound in it that's very close to a statin. I'm not saying throw out your levastatin, but eat more oyster mushrooms. They're also a pretty good immune stimulant as well, and they're just yummy. So in the fall, so the picture there on the left was taken up in Windsor, and I was driving to Augusta to work, and I see this tree out of the corner of my eye, just covered, probably 30, 40 pounds, a little more mature than I like them. And they're a little waterlogged. So I took some pictures and left them. But when I can find them in this, when they're a little curled over, still a little young, that's the ideal. And this species, this is the summer one. This is the typical kind of more pale gray to brownish gray color of the fall mushroom. Just yummy. Now, this is the one that not everybody finds. Where we are blessed here, these are the morels, the true morels that are the most widely collected and eaten wild mushroom in the country, by far. There's some festivals that celebrate these suckers in the Midwest. In Maine, many people go for years and never find one. But there's a couple of keys. They love sweet soil, slightly alkaline, outcrops of limestone, or kind of, fill from the glaciers where it's a little bit more gravelly. So center part of the state has a few. The places where there's limestone and Rockland. That's where you're more likely to find them. And in those areas, look under old apple trees, old apple orchards, in recently dead or dying elm trees. And I find them also in rich woods, kind of almost mycorrhizally with ash. Or if you've got basswood growing it, that's a good sign as well. And here, I kind of look for them kind of Mother's Day to Father's Day, kind of along with the black flies, right? So you may have to deal with those. And if it's a cold year, I don't find them by Mother's Day. It's a little bit later. And if it's cold, wet year, I'll find them through most of June. So keep your eyes open. And they're just a great excuse to get out and work on your forest legs in the spring and feed the black flies. And what the consolation prizes while you're looking for morels are often those early oyster mushrooms and the pheasant back, the dryad saddle. But when you find them, they're just beautiful. They have very little odor. If you have an opportunity, if you find them and can resist it, if they're tiny and young, leave them. Leave them and come back a week to 10 days later when they're mature, because their flavor, if you get a young one, doesn't taste like much. Mature, the flavor is so rich. And again, incredibly versatile. Versatile with eggs in a cream sauce, dry them, put them in risottos and dishes, stuff them with cheese. In parts of the Southeast, they'll dip them in egg batter and roll them in potato chips or cracker crumbs and deep fat fry them. Not my style of cooking, but hey, back in Tennessee, it's famous that they'll look for morels at the same time they're looking for their spring turkeys. And we're still trying to figure out taxonomically what species they are. They have this plasticity of form. They can, so these two, dark, 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 and this pale one collected on the same property, fairly close to each other, under different trees. The ones on the left there, an apple orchard, somewhere in the mid-coast area. The ones up here, near dead elms in Augusta, recently dead elms. They're all tasty. And so the same piece of property where these ones came from, these ones came from. These ones primarily under elm trees, and these ones around ash and some other trees up in that area. And I use a $20 bill for size and because I value them so much. In the Midwest, people say, well, I got 35 pounds of Morels. Here in Maine, we'll say, I got 35 and it was a good year. Yeah. So here, what many people, old timers, old mushroom foragers call Morels are actually the false morel, also sometimes called the lorchel. And this brain, folded brain, reddish brown, it's a beautiful, distinctive mushroom that's much more common in Maine than true Morels. And some people eat them. In fact, in Finland, it is a really famous dish. And the Finnish food safety people will say, if you're selling these, you got to give everybody the directions on how to cook them. And it goes something like this. You get your false Morels and you put them in a big pot of cold water and you bring that up to a boil. And then you pour the water out and refill it with cold water. You do the same thing, you bring it up to a boil and then you pour that out and then you cook them for food. And oh, while you're boiling them, make sure you're doing it in a really well-ventilated area. They've got a toxin in them that's called monomethyl or related to monomethylhydrazine, and which is rocket fuel, very toxic. And many people eat these and then they eat a big batch of them and they get really sick. So I've never eaten these and I'm never going to, but they're really quite beautiful. So this is a different false morel we have here very rarely, but many people eat these, but the real false morel stay away from. And this is comparison of a true morel. And all these three were found within about a quarter mile of each other. Just outside of Camden somewhere. And, this was the third mushroom I ever ate. The first one was a puffball. Second one was a meadow mushroom. The third one was the shaggy mane. And this is a beautiful mushroom. It likes areas where the ground has been disturbed, like people built, a berm or something and buried organic matter, or places where someone has cut trees and the roots are rotting. So it rots buried wood or buried debris. And so they fruit, and they can fruit in huge numbers. This is a photograph taken on North Haven this past fall. So they usually come around the time of the first frost, just before, just after. And they'll fruit heavily for a few years, and then they exhaust that food source, and you're gonna have to find a new place. Back in the late 70s, there was a place on the University of New Mexico campus where I was in college, where every year for 3 years at least, huge numbers of them would fruit. And they're really, really lovely flavor. And there's other inky caps that they somewhat resemble, but this is a really distinctive one. And it has a nice, fine flavor. So when they're young, they're pure white gills. And as they age, they break down by turning into a mass of ink. I call it inkinization, but that's my word. So here's the whole range from that pile I found on North Haven. From the really young, very, very firm. And I would typically eat them up to about here. And if it's a year where I'm not finding many, I may cut off parts of the dark cap and eat the rest of them. Some people who are more adventurous than I will make a squid ink pasta out of the black ones, but I don't. My family wouldn't eat them. So they have a really lovely, distinctive, mild flavor. In my book, I write about them, and I do a recipe for vichyssoise, mushroom leek potato soup that's just lovely. They have a nice flavor of that. So this was a lawn at the Machias Savings Bank in Rangeley. They had done a bunch of landscaping, buried a bunch of things, and literally this is one portion. there were hundreds and hundreds that day in late September. So there's another inky cap. It's called the alcohol inky or Tippler's Bane in the UK that has a compound that if you eat it, it's great. If you combine it with a glass of wine or a beer, you get sick. I ask you, which is toxic, the mushroom or the beer? Yeah, and some people say these do the same thing. No, I mean, I follow the literature on toxicology really, really closely. I've never seen a case, just an allegation. So we're going to move on from gilled mushrooms and trumpets to toothed mushrooms, teeth. This is called, there's two species we're going to talk about, the hedgehog or sweet tooth. I learned them as a sweet tooth. Everybody calls them hedgehogs these days. And they grow in forests. I usually start seeing them in August. They may peak in September, except for the little ones, which really peak in October. So they grow with forest trees. These larger ones, it has this beautiful kind of peach flesh color is quite distinctive. Sometimes they're pure white. And the underside, and I'll show you a picture better, is little stalactite teeth. And that's where the spores form. And we're breaking these down into several other species, but these ones are quite distinctive. So you get these larger ones, and these sometimes get 6 or 7 inches. Though when they get really big, they get bitter. And then the smaller ones, and you'll notice in these smaller ones, it has a little inny belly button. This is hidden umbilicatum. And they typically don't get bigger than about 2 inches. And you find them primarily with hemlocks. So this is a photograph that I took up in Hancock County, one of my favorite forests, just diverse range of trees and lovely mushrooming area. This is the same group. And you can really see that umbilicate area and the little teeth underneath. How many people here know or wish you knew matsutake mushrooms? These ones I find not unusually in the same place where the matsutake are growing. Yeah, they like those hemlocks. And so they have a lovely nutty flavor. And unlike many mushrooms, when you cook these, they stay a little crisp, a little crunchy, nice texture. So a nice textural and flavor combination with chanterelles. So lends well with mild sauces. You could easily overwhelm their mild taste. And as I said, the big ones can get a little bitter with age. And we're going to go into a couple of polypores. This is called the head of the woods, the Japanese name, and when it's cultivated, usually sold under the name maitake. Means for dancing mushrooms. And they're butt rotters, just like that jack-o'-lantern mushroom. So you will find them fruiting around the base of the tree where their mycelium is rotting the hardwood, heartwood. And so this is a small one. It was growing near like a 10-inch hemlock, but most often, about 90% of the time, I find them with red oaks here. Occasionally with ash. I've found them with a couple other things, but don't look for them on anything but ash and oaks for the most part, because it's just frustrating. And these ones, I find them occasionally at the end of August, but usually early to mid-September, you start to see them after we get some of those nighttime temperatures firmly down in the 50s. And where you want to look for them is where you find big oaks. And so it's a wonderful late summer, early fall walk in the woods. And when you collect them, you want to collect them when the pore surface, and I'll show you the pore surface, maybe I won't. Let's go backward. Here we go. When the pore surface is still firm and it's pure white. So this is a typical area. You can see that one on the left, at least 3 clusters around a big old oak tree. This one had about 8 clusters around it at that time. Almost always on the ground, though this was fruiting from well-rotted wood. So on the ground around the base of a tree. And if you're lucky enough to find one, remember where you found it. Even if it was old and moldy this year, you're going to go back the same time of year next year. The first one of these I ever found, I can't remember now, either 1982 or 1983, within a year or 2 after I moved here. And that tree, though it's essentially hollow now, it's still alive, still fruits a couple of clusters every couple of years. That's been a long time. So don't lose that tree. I have some people I know that kind of run their hand of the wood trap lines every fall. Check and see which ones are fruiting. So here's a range of them. Again, that's up on the top. You can see the number of clusters around. I went into that forest, which is not too far from my office. And it's about a mile into where these trees are. There's like 5 big oak trees. And not this year, but last year, all 5 of them produced multiple clusters, probably 150 pounds of mushrooms. I didn't need any. I didn't take any out that day because I already had enough at home and I didn't want them to rot. So the hen of the woods, we have a tradition every year. The first hen I find, I chop it up coarsely and I saute it with some olive oil and some garlic, usually some tamari, and I have it over rice. That's dinner. High in protein, high in glucans that stimulate your immunity, a nice flavor. They do really well frozen and used through the winter. You can dry them and grind them into a powder and use that flavor for its flavor and medicinal components and its protein. Don't dry them and use them whole because the texture is kind of like the leather on my shoes when they're rehydrated. Just a really versatile in terms of its what you cook with it. It's also really popular medicinal. And we started doing some clinical trials to develop it as an anti-cancer medicine. And they stopped, I think, not because they were having trouble, but they couldn't find a way to license it enough and make enough money. Because you've ever looked up how much it costs to get a medication through the FDA? I think it's going along about $3 billion. So we just get to collect them and eat them. And we find in the phase 1 trials that, where they test for kind of toxic side effects, that it's slightly lowered blood glucose. Most of the diet in this country, we run a little high, so that's a good thing. They've been doing a little bit of checking it out for diabetes work. And another fall mushroom, this is another tooth one. You ever seen these? It's like you see this ice fall of teeth along the side of a tree or a log on the ground, usually on birch or beech or maple, most commonly on beech. And it's average, maybe about this big. I've seen them, 4 times that size. Very, very distinctive. If it's growing on wood and it looks like this is what it is. There's 2 species that are common here, a third one a little bit further south, often cultivated. Typically, I found them as early as in end of August, usually September, and well into October until we get a killing frost. Nice texture. Who's here is really strict with the vegetarianism? Many people, my friend, who's very serious about her vegetarian diet, uses this mushroom and makes a faux seafood bisque or stew or chowder because she misses that and the flavor is similar. And when you want to collect it, this one's really, really young. And you see that pinkish blush? Beautiful. So when they're really young, sometimes you get that. And when they're mature, they get this beautiful pure white look. And then as they get too old, they start to get a little bit of rosy and soft, and you don't want to eat them. So eat them when they're young and firm and white, or really young and kind of pink. Very distinctive. And it's an excellent edible. There's a couple of different species. The lion's mane erinaceus is often cultivated, very commonly found cultivated. It's a great edible. It's a good little immune stimulator. It's also medicinally, not only that immune stimulation, it's got a class of compounds in it that stimulate in our bodies nerve regeneration. So it stimulates the production of nerve growth factor, which means it could be active beyond the blood-brain barrier. And there's been some clinical trials early on, mostly in Japan, in treatment of mild to moderate dementia, just with dried fruiting bodies that showed very strong effect. And there's a lot of kind of cognitive stimulation preparations out there. I typically dry them and tincture them because that class of compounds are alcohol soluble, and it's a nice way of concentrating it. Good mushroom. I think I already talked about that. So let's deal with this first mushroom I ever ate, the puffballs. Puffballs are very, very distinctive. They're these round globs, oftentimes the smaller ones come out about the size of softballs. And they look a lot like softballs. And the giant ones look a lot like soccer balls. In fact, how many of those have I seen in people's yards or yard sides thinking that they were puffballs were soccer balls? So we have easily, half dozen puffballs that are eaten pretty commonly in this part of the world. Some of them, several species, tiny, maybe up to 2 inches in diameter. And then we have a species called the purple spored puffball that average size is maybe 6 inches. And then we've got the giant puffball. And I have seen them in the state of Maine, about 30 inches across. Really commonly, 10 inches to a foot in that firm, pure white, like this one, which I stopped and took this picture down in a gunquit a couple of falls ago. Occasionally I'll find puffballs fruiting in June, if we get a wet June, but usually September and into early October. And you see, these ones, they're beautiful. They tend to like either rich farmland kind of pasture or areas where the soil is a little sweeter. I collected one of these and I brought it over to my next door neighbor, and his mother had moved in with him as she was aging. And I knew she loved wild mushrooms. So I brought this nice, relatively small giant puffball to her. And it sparked this story. And that's what I love, getting the stories. And she said, we used to collect those up off Center Street here. It must have been 30 years ago. And I said, yep, that's the exact same place I got this one. Because they'll come back, if not the same place, the same region, year after year. So this is my son, and I have an older one. I've one that was taken when Dash was about 14 or 15. And then I took this one a few years ago with a giant puffball collected from that same site. And the ones atop here, this is the purple sport puffball. And usually, like I said, you top out at about 5 inches or so. And this is, I call this the myopic puffball. So you want to get them when they're like here, pure white on the inside. As they age, they start to turn a little yellow, get soft, less interesting. The tiny ones, as they age and mature, it turns yellow and then they turn green. And when they get yellow, those ones are quite bitter. So I always, when I'm collecting them and as I put them in the pot, I cut them longitudinally to make sure they're firm and white on the inside. So here's some of the smaller ones. We've got the pear-shaped puffball on the left there, and the gem-studded puffball here. And this one is a little different species, but in the pear-shaped group. And sometimes in the woods, you can find dozens and dozens of them, just kind of littering a rotting log or some wood debris. And I just put that in because it's beautiful. This one was actually, this was up on the edge of the Camden Hills State Park. And I took the picture of this is a Norway maple. I find them sometimes into the edge of the woods under Norway maple. I don't know why. I don't know what the association is, but that's why I took that photograph. So I started out cooking and eating puffballs, and then I moved to Maine, and I got into all these fancy things like black trumpets and chanterelles, and I turned away from them. And then one year I was doing a cooking demonstration at the Common Ground Fair, and I had good, firm, giant puffball. I had some horse mushroom, the Agaricus arvensis, and I had some maitake, the hen of the woods. I cooked them all separately, all the same way, olive oil, a little bit of salt and pepper. That's it, cubed up. And I had this group of people, larger than this, and we tested them, toothpicks. And I had people give their opinions. And most people said, that puffball, boy, the flavor, the texture, it stood up to any of those just as well. And I agreed with them. So try them out. Because when you find a large one, it's a lot of food. Eat them when they're young and firm. You treat them like tofu in terms of cubing them up, sauteing them, even crispy a little bit so you get that outer crunch and the soft interior. Tasty. And there's one lookalike that I don't think is a lookalike, but you have to be careful of. There are these puffballs, a whole genus. There's about 3 common species here. that are called the pigskin puffballs or earth balls. And when you cut them open from a fairly early age, they're this dark purple gray to black. Sometimes when you get them really, really young, they might be white, which always disturbs me. But, you know, this is the citrina because it's got that almost like an orange or a lemon rind to it. And they're just pure black. And these ones, most people, they'll quickly, about 20 minutes after eating them, you have the herbs. Some people eat them without problems. And if you're one of those people, don't proselytize. Don't share them with your neighbors. I had a woman almost take my head off. At the Common Ground Fair, I had this table with mushrooms just to show off. And she says, "Do you eat those?" And I said, "No, they're toxic." And, you know, she had this neighbor up Campway, always eat those. And this one year he found a bunch of them and he generously gave some to her husband and her. And she cooked them 20 minutes later, sick as dogs. Yeah. So here's several different species in that same group. Thick rind, that pig skin, and very dark inside. So I do not include any boletes in my foolproof mushrooms because I don't find them easy. I'm going to be doing a talk like this. It's going to be called Beyond the Basics in Mushrooming and featuring the boletes. I eat a lot of boletes, but in some of them, it's taking me years to decide that's what I want. I was going to eat those. You know, the king bolete, the porcini, the steinpilz, the pinny bun, the sep, you know, world famous wherever it grows, lovely. But as a mushroom toxic consultant, every year, 1, 2, sometimes 3 people get into this. It does not even have a common name, Boletus heronensis. And unlike the king bolete, yellow pores that stain blue. Why anyone would eat it, I don't know. And it has caused some really severe symptomology. So you need to learn about them. Take your time. There's a bunch of boletes, and many of them are lovely edibles, but you take your time. A couple of those I just want to mention. Chaga is a medicinal mushroom that everybody loves. It's not edible. It's a great medicinal, but it's very woody. So I'm just going to show you a couple. And the chaga, because it's so popular and everybody wants it, I worry about it getting over harvested. It is not a fruiting body. It is a mass of vegetative hyphae, which is fancy terms, and it grows on the side of a living birch tree that it is parasitizing. And it looks like, they used to call it the birch clinker because it looks kind of charred and hard and it's quite woody. And to use it, you collect it and you can use it fresh, but I typically dry it first, and you can grind it and make a tea. I also tincture it. It's a lovely, gentle immune stimulant, and it's I value it very strongly as an anti-inflammatory. In my own anecdotal evidence, for the first 20 years I lived in Maine, I suffered with bronchitis once, twice a year through the winter. I started using chaga. I have had 2 mild cases of bronchitis in almost the past 20 years. The only thing I've changed. I know there's that anti-inflammatory. I have people who swear by it for bursitis and joint pain. It's unmistakable, and it likes mostly on birch. I occasionally find it on hop hornbeam, but white birch, yellow birch, large ones, grows slowly. And here's a couple more pictures. Here's the inside. If you ever collect one and it's black on the inside, it means someone got off a dead tree. And so the interior's died. So you want to get it when that gold and orange, beautiful color is on the inside, black on the outside. And if you're collecting it, don't cut the tree. If the tree is healthy, you just take even a fist and hit it to the side, and the chaga will fall off. A rock, a stick, blunt end of a hatchet, something like that. Don't need to harm the tree. If the tree is healthy, it'll regenerate over the next few years. And the other one, which is just beautiful, and is probably the closest thing we have to a panacea mushroom historically, is called Reishi, or the hemlock varnish conch, lingji. The mushroom of immortality is one of the common names for it. And this is a mushroom that's beautiful. beautiful. This is still really a little young. It's still actively growing because it has that white edge. But when it's mature, it has this dark burnished reddish brown with a varnished sheen to it. And it grows on wood. Here, most commonly, in fact, I call it the hemlock varnish conch because this species grows primarily on hemlock, sometimes on spruce. And it'll grow starting end of May, early June, grow, mature by mid-August, unless you get later rain and you get some later starting. And it's been used medicinally in China, maybe 7,000 years. Japan, at least 3,000 years, we have the documentation. And if you make a tea of this, you know it's medicinal. It is bitter, harsh, but it's got a lot of really good research, both in the Western medicine as well as in more of it in Eastern medicine, used quite actively. Here's a couple of photographs. So the one on the left there is one 2 years in a row I found it growing, and last year it was growing on the ground, and I took a picture of it when it was about this big. And I took this picture about 15 days later, and it was about this big. And I came back about 2 weeks later, and it was about this big. And I knew that if I didn't pick it, someone else was going to find it. So I took, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. So they grow slowly, can get quite large. And here, the one on the left is growing from buried wood. This is the same site this year where it was growing, and it was on a spruce tree in that case, on the tree itself. Here it's on a dead hemlock, which is the frequent host. And, I debated, do I include the meadow mushroom and horse mushroom? They're the wild variant of the supermarket button mushroom and the portobello. Same group in the genus Agaricus. And some years they are really common. Some people call them pink bottoms because the smaller ones, especially when they open up from a button, immediately the gill surface is pink. And then it goes dark pink to pinkish brown to dark brown as it matures. Dark brown like a portobello underside. They always have a little bit of a ring around the stalk, but the littler ones, over time, that ring tends to disappear. They like open grasslands, disturbed grasslands, parks. You don't find, there's a couple species you find in the woods too. And if you learn them, they can be a workhorse. And the kind of summers we've been having, wicked hot, dry, and then heavy intermittent thunder showers. That is the kind of year and the kind of weather pattern these guys love. 2 years ago, that really long, extended, wet period, hardly any. This past late summer and fall, when the rain started, I found a lot of these. So here's the pink bottom, and you can see pink, pinkish brown, deeper brown. Yeah, very distinctive. And, I call it a workhorse edible. They're a lovely flavor. And sometimes you find a big basket of them. Everybody know what the sauce duxelles is? It's this coarsely chopped mushrooms. You put them in the largest pan you have with a little bit of oil, and you saute them, maybe a little bit of salt, not a whole lot else, and you cook them. And you cook them, and you cook them, and you cook them until much of the moisture is boiled off. And you've got this dark brown, grayish brown, kind of ugly looking paste with this rich flavor. So I do this big pan of it, and then I freeze them in the bottom of muffin tins, like little hockey pucks that I freeze in a Ziploc bags for winter use. So it's this little burst of mushroom flavor in the middle of winter. And this is the other one that I had on the list that I'm throwing out because so many people eat it. Anybody know the lobster mushroom? It's biologically a strange little character. So in the woods, much through the summer and into the fall, there's this huge group of mushrooms that are called russulas that everybody gets frustrated because they're so hard to identify. And some milky caps, the lactarius. And this is a young russula or lactarius, different species, that gets attacked by a mold. and it changes, usually almost pure white mushroom. It kind of deforms it and it turns this bright cooked lobster orange. When I was first learning mushrooming, all the field guides said, you don't want to eat this mushroom unless you know it was fruiting or growing on an edible species. And you never know what it's growing on. But people eat them. But I've dealt with some cases recently of people reacting to them. So I'm a little bit off of them, but many people still eat them and enjoy them. Very distinctive. And where they grow probably most prolifically is under white pine, growing with it's called the short-stalked Russell, a Russula brevipies, but others as well. Oops, there we go. So where do you go from here? In terms of your learning, I call this an arm candy show. This is to kind of get you excited. It's not really diving into distinctive features. This is one of my favorite boletes, a little bicolor bolete, and I just put that in there because it was a nice picture. So one thing I want to say is to be right. Yeah, I love this. Huh? My son found this. No mushroom hunting. Mine. They're all mine. But I use this funny picture just to kind of invite you to know where you're collecting your mushrooms. And if it's not your land, they're not your mushrooms. Even though we have this open access, unless the woods are posted, I've learned to knock on a door or make a phone call to say, hey, do you mind? And I've met some really interesting people that way. One guy, huge white, sugar maple covered with oyster mushrooms. I knock on the door and say, hey, I introduce myself. Do you mind if I take some photographs and maybe collect some of the oyster mushrooms growing on your yard? He says, what oyster mushroom? So I showed him and we talked about it. And he said, well, leave some for me. Probably 40 pounds of oyster mushrooms. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so you make good friends, and rarely have I had people say no. And when they've said no, it's because there's somebody else that they know that they invite to collect those mushrooms. So knock on the door, seek permission. And then as you go into this, as you go into learning, there's a couple of things. Before you ever collect and eat a mushroom, make sure you have a mechanism for learning. And we all learn differently. Some people learn by going out in the woods with someone who knows. So I have I have way too many field guides. So I started out, from guides, and I didn't know anybody was mushrooming back then. So a lot of that learning was slow and self-taught. So use field guides. There are some really good websites, and then there's some other websites. Hang out and observe on the regional Facebook pages. Don't use them as your sole source for identification, because it's identification by crowdsourcing. And sometimes, particularly early on, people make mistakes. Take a class, join a public walk. I do mushroom identification workshops around the state through the summer and fall. Join the Maine Mycological Association, which is a club of people who are interested in mushrooms, mostly nerdy. My favorite kind of people. I'm one of the directors there. If you can, find a mentor. Find a mentor and do whatever you can to make them smile when they see you coming. That means if they're not into baking, you bake them that bread, you bake them those fresh made cookies. And you invite them to tour your woods and you'll cook them dinner. If they like those nice, robust, fruit-forward red wines, the Malbecs and things, make sure you bring them one. What you don't do is you say, hey, can you show me where you collect mushrooms? Oh, and your favorite fishing hole too? Don't do that. Yeah. So that's a good start. And then once you start collecting mushrooms for food, start slow. Start slow and stay safe. Never, ever, the birders who wanted the longest life list of birds, don't do that with mushrooms, you'll get sick. Because, all mushrooms are edible, but some of them, only once. Yeah. So collect only from uncontaminated ground. So I don't, for food anyway, I never collect off of a golf course or those heavy traveled roads, anything that might be contaminated with pesticides or herbicides. For food, Collect mushrooms that are in great shape, young, firm, because an old mushroom quickly becomes a moldy mushroom, which can sicken you, other than the mushroom. But if you're looking for identification, you want to get all stages, all parts of the mushroom, because any of those may be needed for accurate description. Make a spore print, which is a way of collecting the color of the spores. And you never ever eat a mushroom unless you're absolutely certain of what it is and its edibility. And I have had history where I'd collect a mushroom, particularly, as I get into some more obscure ones. I collect it, I learn about it, I identify it, I'm sure of it. I collect it again, I don't need it. I collect it again, I don't need it. I collect it the next year when I can identify what it is walking up to it. Typically, I don't need it then either. But about the fourth time, I feel comfortable collecting and eating it. Now, with these foolproof ones, you can be a little bit more, not cavalier, but a little bit more bold. And then finally, when you first start eating a mushroom, always cook them well. There are some wonderfully edible mushrooms, like Morels, that are toxic if you eat them raw. So cook them well. Never consider mushrooms part of your raw food diet. They're hard for us to digest, even if they're totally edible. So cooking helps to do that. If you're eating new species, only eat one new species of mushroom at a time. If you collect 5 different species, you throw them in a pot and you cook them up and you get sick, that's 5 mushrooms you won't eat because you don't know which one sickened you. Eat a small amount initially. If I'm trying a new mushroom, I'm the only one that eats it. I'm my own guinea pig. I don't share them with anyone else until I know about it. If you're unsure at all, make sure you photographed it. Because most of the time, occasionally I have to go see the mushrooms or get them to me, but most of the time I do my toxicology identifications based on photographs. Always be cautious sharing with people who are really young or really vulnerable. And if you're selling them or not selling them, if you're sharing them with your friends, you're having a bunch of people over for dinner and you're serving wild harvested mushrooms, tell them. Some people are terrified about mushrooms. So I always say, these are mushrooms that I've collected. These are what they are. And if people say, I don't think so, don't cajole them. Just say more from me. Because there's this direct line from anxiety to our upset stomach. And sometimes that's all alone that it takes. And the last thing is make sure you're having fun when you're out collecting. So this is that same big mushroom. Yeah. So let's talk about some resources moving forward. I brought a couple of field guides. My book is not a field guide. It is a storybook of true stories about mushrooms, edibility, toxicology, psychoactive, ecological stories. But there's a few, if you just want to start out, Gary Linkoff's Mushroom Hunter, not the mushroom Audubon guy. The mushrooms in Northeastern United States. I got that one today. David Spars, I couldn't find my copy when I rushed over here today. He's a Washington, Maine guy. So edible medicinal mushrooms in New England, and it goes on from there. It's a big long title. There's several others. And there's a few mushrooms websites I really recommend. The one that I've got up here, mushroomexpert.com. It's a Midwest guy, Michael Quo. And actually I brought one of his books too. Now, it's a great site for identification. He doesn't make any statements about edibility or toxicity. Just don't do that. You have to find other sources for that. There's some other, how many people here read French decently? There's an incredible website called Myco Quebec. I consult it more often than any other website I use because I got a lot of really good mycologists up there. And I don't have good skills in reading French, but I read Latin. So look for books in your area. Look at the websites or Facebook sites for this region. Maine Mushrooms is a pretty good one. Mushroom Madness is a little bit edgier. I've got some copies of the Chanterelle Dreams. You can get it from me tonight. You can get it from Chelsea Green or Amazon. And really, Think about where you want to go with this. If you're desiring to learn 3 edibles, you can do that pretty easily. If you're desiring to learn mushrooms, plan on a lifetime of fun, lifetime of stimulation and exploration. So I do a lot of different classes. I do them all on the side, so they're not my main gig. But if you sign up with a website, I send out typically a schedule of where I'm going to be teaching once or twice a year. And really, in the end, going back to Rumi, let the beauty you love be what you do. There's 1,000 ways, I'd say more, to kneel and kiss the earth. And mushrooming is just one of them, but to me, it's that way into nature. And it's the process of mushrooming as much as the product that feeds my soul. I work in an entirely different field most of the time. I do suicide prevention, suicide response work, and mushrooms help balance that out. So they serve me well and have for many years. So questions?
Excellent. I want to start out with technically 2 questions on Zoom that I'm going to combine into one. Someone asks, is there a best practice for harvesting mushrooms like chanterelles or others, where leaving some behind helps replenish the spores, or are the spores always in the soil or the tree and will come back regardless of where you cut it? And then another person also asked, how do you harvest mushrooms specifically? Do you use a knife and cut them? And if so, how far down? So sort of just the basics of actually harvesting them.
So, kind of hygiene and ethics around safe harvesting. So let's use chanterelles, and we're going to use chanterelles for both of those. If I'm in the woods, like one of those photographs up there was taken in this lovely place in the middle of this forest I love, not too far from Augusta, where I go in and take a 20-minute, 30-minute walk at lunch to clear my head. And there's this patch of chanterelles that grow in there, and they typically refruit about 3 times through the season. And I never, ever take all those chanterelles. I always leave the youngest and I leave the most mature. Some people say never take more, or always leave at least 30%. With black trumpets, you don't have to worry because you're never going to find them all. They hide too well. The other piece is that question that's related, and they've done some really huge studies with chanterelles about harvesting techniques and how it impacts refruiting. Remember that the mycelium, the vegetative part of the mushroom, is perennial. And for the chanterelles, that mat of mycelium can be healthy and constant so long as the trees are not impacted. And so there's some studies, and they started out, in Central Europe, where they saw the harvest of chanterelles falling. And they said, it's them damn mushroom collectors. They're getting too many of the mushrooms. And what they did is they did studies. So they did another one in Oregon. They have 3 plots in a forest that's pretty homogeneous. And one plot is their control. They just count how many chanterelles fruit every year. And one plot, they cut the chanterelles near the ground and harvested as many as they can as they came to maturity, and they count refruiting every year. And in the 3rd plot, they plucked them. And then they might clean off the base of it before they put them in their basket. So they remove the entire fruiting body, count how many refruit every year. So this is the control. And compared to the control, where they cut those mushrooms, they found after about 18 years, the first time they published the data, that the number of refruiting dropped a little bit. And where they plucked them, they found that the numbers refruiting increased a little bit. Statistically, not huge either way. And here's my theory on that. If you cut that mushroom off at near ground level, you leave a little plug that's about 80 to 90% water, 25 to 40% protein, lots of good amino acids and nutrients for a vector to rot it down into the mycelium. Whereas if you pluck it, there's less chance of that. But the biggest thing, you never want to get them all. And you want to do as little disturbance of the soil, the duff, as possible. But be ethical in how you collect. If I'm collecting mushrooms and it's not my property, but it's public access, I never get them all. I always leave most of them there for the next person because I don't own that property. So be thoughtful. Good questions. I love those questions. What else?
So just to sum up what you just said, it's better to pluck the mushroom than to use the knife, even though all your photos you had a knife.
I often cut them, or I cut them after I pluck them. I cut off that dirty base because I don't want them in my basket. And I use the knife because it's a wonderful size. And that beautiful bluish knife, that was a gift from a wonderful artist down in Damerscott area, Jacques Vessery. I call it my dress knife, and I keep it in a little satchel on my waist, and I use it for photographs. And I'm going to, at some point, publish a book with just his knife photographs because it's just so beautiful. Yeah.
I do have another question if I could ask. Someone said that you can spread like mushroom spores and grow them on a stump if you have a stump in your garden. Is that true? And how does that work?
I've known people who've done that a lot. I've known very, very few who had success, particularly if you have a fresh cut stump, you can get the mycelium grown out on dowels and tap that stump that way. And it's a pretty effective way of inoculating the mushrooms. There was things like chanterelles that they grow in symbiotically with the tree, with the roots of the trees. Usually there's a lot of competition. It's hard to sow them. If you have a really productive, as an example of a chanterelle patch that's growing on fir, and there's some fir seedlings going in that same patch, dig up a few of those seedlings and transplant them. And that is a low-tech but fairly effective way of transplanting chanterelles. And there's no harm, no foul with spreading those spores or that slurry. It's just not the most effective way of doing it.
There's a couple main companies. Can I add that there are a couple main companies, North Spore and Cap and Stem? Is it Cap and Stem
Cap and
in
stem, yes.
Gardner that sell mycelium in sawdust spawn or
Wooden
dowels,
yeah.
and they have really good advice about how to inoculate your own stumps
Yeah.
or wood.
Yeah, there are other companies out there that's out of Maine, but those two are really primo. The fellows at North Spore, a couple of them graduated from College Atlantic, and they had attended a couple of lectures I gave there, and then they got started. It's been wonderful to see what they have grown over the years. There's one, if you're interested in gardening, there's a really easy mushroom to grow in your garden. Particularly, I use raised beds, and in between my raised beds, I fill the paths with wood chips. And particularly if you have hardwood or mixed hardwood and softwood wood chips, the wine cap stropharia, and you can get the spawn from either of those companies. It grows prolifically and rapidly. Wine cap stropharia rugosa annulata, of course. But you knew that. Yeah. It's called the garden giant or the wine cap stropharia. Yeah, unmistakable. I can show you a picture when you come up later. So other questions about mushrooms you thought might be on this list but weren't? Shrimp of the woods. So shrimp of the woods, it's called the aborted entoloma sometimes also, Entoloma arbortivum. And it's again, another ecologically fascinating species in that there's this little gray entoloma, and entolomas by and large, you don't want to touch because there's a lot of toxic ones. But this one, there's this interaction or parasitism between a honey mushroom mycelium and the entoloma, and it makes these kind of gnarled, twisted, very distinctive growths. And many people eat them. And many people, if you know them well, will eat the unaborted form. Is it a beginner's mushroom? Maybe not, but it's a pretty safe edible. I've never run into the case of someone sickened by it. Yeah. It's probably the only entoloma species, unaborted ones, that I eat. Other thoughts?
This is a little maybe out there, but what is a mushroom's purpose?
Other than pleasing us? So the mushroom, think of the analogy of your tomato plants. That the mushroom is the tomato. It's the fruiting body of the fungus that is mostly underground or in the wood. That's the vegetative body, just like the leaves, the stem, and the roots of the tomato are its vegetative body. So like the tomato, It's not, doesn't grow to grace our salads. It grows to mature seeds and help to spread those. It makes this gorgeous fruit, so somebody's going to eat it. The mushroom comes up and it spreads, and it's a vector for maturing those spores, most of them out into the wind. Yeah. And some of them are toxic so that someone doesn't eat them before the spores mature. Yeah. To use mushroom talk. It's a good question.
Can you do something to your property to increase productivity?
Absolutely. And the biggest thing you can do is make sure you've got a variety of tree species growing on it. And to leave things not too manicured. So you know those lawns that come out of House Beautiful? You know, where there's a lot of unguents and potions that go into them. Most of those are not very good at growing mushrooms, and I wouldn't want to collect the mushrooms off it. But these kind of half wild lawns, particularly if you've got a great big old oak tree and maybe some spruce and hemlock, damn, you're setting yourself up for mushrooms.
I have a wood chipper. I live in a spruce forest, and it has a few great big oak trees. Oh, just a half a dozen pine trees, but 99% of it is spruce.
Mm-hmm.
And I created walking trails from trees that have fallen down. I chip them up, or the wind blows them over.
Yep.
And I use the wood for lumber, and then chip the rest of the tree, and I laid it out on the trails over a quarter of a mile, half a mile. And I found that last year, I found that late in September and early October,
And the rains came.
both sides of the trail were lined with chanterelles.
Mm-hmm. So the chanterelles were growing with the roots of those spruce. And they often, they tend to favor edges more than the middle of the woods. So it's not unusual for you to find them on pathways or roadways edges as the field, at the edge of the field. So the wood chips are going to sustain a better moist environment for their fruiting. Yeah.
That's what's going on there.
Now, our use of wood chips have proliferated some species of mushrooms, like that winecap stropharia, I find growing wild a lot. But some of those are not edible. So don't assume, but if they're chanterelles, they're chanterelles. Those are pretty
Mhm.
clear. Enjoy those. Now, where do you live?
In St. George. Yep.
Maine is full of beautiful places to collect mushrooms. Great.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate it. So you mentioned there's roughly 2,000 mushrooms across the state, but only 10% are edible and a handful are toxic. What about the other
No,
1,800?
about 10% of them are also toxic.
10% are
Yeah,
toxic.
and a lot of them we just haven't really figured out. We haven't tried. It's hard to find those controlled studies where I say, all right, I want you 10 to eat this mushroom. And we learn it slowly over time. And also still in this country, we're much more conservative about the range of mushrooms we eat compared to, say, many of the Slavic countries. Like many of those russulas that I say, I'm going to avoid them because I can't be sure what the species are. They say, russula? How hot is it? I'll eat it. Yeah, they eat them all. They're much more cavalier, and they're also a little bit more accepting of that occasional gastric upset. I hate throwing up. So I'm pretty conservative, and still, in the average year, I eat probably between 35 and 45 species. And I'm pretty conservative. I take all those calls from the Poison Center.
So the rest of those mushrooms, the 80% or so, they've been identified, just most don't experiment with eating them.
Realistically, I used to say 20% of our mushrooms have some degree of edibility or understanding, but I'm a little conservative around that. A lot of them we just don't know. There's a lot of boletes. There's a number of boletes that are edible. There's a few that are toxic. There's some we just don't know. That lilac brown bolete, which in my old books was called edible, still people trying to eat that. And I met one man. He said, I collect and eat those. I cook them well, I eat them. And I collected from the same place, and he ate them 3 years in a row. And the fourth year, he just got wicked sick. So, I hate throwing up.
And then one other question about you observing people get sick. Like, what are common mushrooms that people get sick in the state of Maine?
So probably some that are most common is that jack-o'-lantern mushroom. Every year I deal with several cases of people getting sick eating that. Surprisingly, there's a group of bolete called Lexinum, the scaber stalks. And the trouble is there's a whole lot of different scaber stalks, and most people try and lump them under one or two. And over a 30-year period across the country, 3.5% of our sickenings were from that genus. Every year or so I have people, the pigskin puffballs, people get sick eating those. And about 80% of our calls involve really short people that never get sick. But of those who sicken, it's often people either who are from away and don't know the mushrooms and make assumptions, like that Boletus heronensis, or people who are too bold. Their enthusiasm gets ahead of their learning curve. Some of the less toxic amanitas that way, and every year or two, even the deadly amanitas, we have people that eat them and get really sick. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Are there any actually deadly?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I do poison mushroom talks as well. And some of the amanitas in the destroying angel group, they're beautiful. They're pure angelic white. And apparently if you eat them, they taste good. But if you eat a dinner of them, about on average 8 hours later, you develop pretty severe GI stuff. And that's going to last really nasty diarrhea and vomiting, blood, for about 24 hours. And then it's going to settle down. And unless they've really tested your liver function, they're going to send you home. And you're going to come back about 30 hours later with signs of acute liver failure. And it destroys your liver. And absent a transplant, you may die. So those are the ones you don't want to eat. Yeah. That one is, it's called the destroying angel. There's 3 species that are pretty common in Maine that are in that pure white group. Amanita bispora gira is the most common. And there's a bunch of good toxic mushrooms you need to learn on the way to learning edible mushrooms. Yeah. And as I said in that, you spend as much time learning the ones that'll sicken you as you do the ones that you want to cook for dinner. So you get a little more confidence. And come out and do a day-long workshop with me. And anybody, this is just exposure. If you do an identification workshop with me, I develop this, I call it a consultancy agreement. And it means your job is to collect the mushrooms and really work hard to determine what they are. And if you're not sure and you're thinking about eating them, email me some good photographs and I'll confirm or deny. And if you email me 20 photographs of 20 mushrooms and say, tell me what they are, I don't know, they end up in my junk mail. I won't do that because it doesn't build your skills. And that's the goal, to make myself superfluous.
Excellent. Thanks, Greg. This is terrific.
Good timing.